Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of Digital Fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today's video is the start of Bloomburrow spoiler season. Officially, we have a ton of spoilers to go through, so I am going to try and just get to that as quick as possible, but before we do, make sure you like the video if you haven't already. It's you guys liking the video every time that has helped this channel to grow so quickly, and we are this close to 10K subscribers. We're so close. And that's thanks to you guys, so thank you so much to those that do it. You are appreciated. It does make a difference. And if you're new here, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an upload. Tons of spoiler content on the way. A lot of cool deck techs coming as soon as Bloomburrow launches. Lots of crazy stuff on the way, so make sure you subscribe. Also, I'm going to put a link in the comments to my spoiler season playlist because in between these long form videos where we detail all of the spoilers released in a day, I do throw out a bunch of spoiler shorts, and I try to get the spoiler shorts up a lot quicker. So if you want to see the brand new card the second it's announced, check out the spoiler season. Like I said, I'm going to link that in the comments, and you can stay up to date on some of the spoilers that are announced in between these longer videos. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's just jump right into the cards here because we have a lot to go over. So we're going to start with 𝐒𝐿𝐴 Mentor. This is an uncommon. 2/3 Bird Scout with Flying for 3 mana in the colors of Azorius. And whenever it or another creature you control with flying enters, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control without flying. So nice little piece of limited here. Limited value. 2/3 flyer for 3 is pretty decent on its own, but being able to put +1/+1 counters on your non-flyers when your flyers enter is some really interesting synergy. And it makes me think that there are archetypes within this set for limited specifically that are built around, you know, a healthy balance between non-flying creatures and flying creatures. So I'm really interested to see where cards like this kind of archetype really winds up. Maybe this is like the bird sort of slant and the type of archetype that birds are tilted towards. Not sure, but we'll have to wait and see. Next up, we've got 3-Tree City. Now, this is one that we saw leaked before spoiler season ever started. This is a legendary land. Enters, choose a creature type, and then you can tap it to add a colorless mana, or you can pay 2 and tap it to choose a color and add an amount of mana of that color equal to the number of creatures you control of the chosen type. So this is sort of like a Gaia's Cradle or a Nykthos, but it cares about how wide you go with creatures of a certain type, so it's going to work for things like token creatures and stuff especially. So if you can go super wide with tokens for the same creature type, I think that's where you can get the most value out of a card like this, and just really kind of go over the top with generating an insane amount of mana really early in the game. But next up, we've got Fireglass Mentor, a 3/2 mouse soldier with vigilance and haste for 3 mana in the colors of Boros. Honestly, pretty decent as an uncommon. It also has Valiant. Whenever Fireglass Mentor becomes the target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. Now, this is sort of like a redone version of Heroic, and it's kind of interesting. Whenever it becomes the target of a spell or ability you control specifically, so it's not going to trigger if your opponent targets it, and it's only going to trigger on the first time each turn. But it doesn't have to just be a spell, it can be an ability, and then you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So if you're using beneficial effects of other cards that you have to target your creatures to make them better already, they're going to get even better with something like this Valiant ability triggering and putting an extra counter on it, which this card in particular is pretty good in regards to that. I mean, having a 3/2 Vigilance Haste body for 3 is already pretty decent, so if it can get really big really quick by constantly targeting it with things every turn, seems halfway decent. Next up, we've got Castrel, the Wind Crested, a 4/5 legendary bird scout with flying for 5 mana in the colors of Azorius. Whenever one or more birds you control deal combat damage to a player, you choose one. You may put a bird creature card from your hand or graveyard onto the battlefield with a finality counter on it, or put a +1/+1 counter on each bird you control, or draw a card. Now, what's cool about this is even though it triggers once whenever one or more birds deal combat damage to a player, so you're only going to get that one trigger typically during the combat step. If you have something like Double Strike, or even just a first strike creature also hitting in, you will deal combat damage twice. Once for first strike damage, once for normal damage, so you can trigger this twice in a turn that way, which seems really interesting. Being able to just plop birds from your hand or graveyard onto the battlefield for free seems kinda crazy, but even if you're out of gas, you can draw cards or just make your go wide board bigger with counters. And all of that seems awesome. The fact that this ability is never really gonna whiff and you're always gonna have something good you can do when you connect in combat seems really, really good. So I'm interested to see if this card is good enough and constructed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm really wondering how deep Bird Tribal is gonna go. But next up, we've got Flowerfoot Swordmaster. This is a 1/2 mouse soldier for 1 white mana. It also has the ability Offspring 2. And the way Offspring works is you pay the mana cost that's read after the Offspring keyword, which in this case is 2. And if you do, when you play it, when you cast the spell, you create a 1/1 token copy of the spell on ETB. So how this would work is it's a 1/2 for 1, but if you pay 1 and 2 colorless, so a total of 3 mana, you get the 1/2 Flowerfoot Swordmaster and a 1/1 copy of the Flowerfoot Swordmaster. And both of them will have all of the abilities of Flowerfoot Swordmaster, so it also has Valiant. Whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, all mice you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. So if you make 2 copies of this, you know, for 3 mana, if each of them becomes targeted once in a turn, each of them is going to give all of your mice +1/+0. So really cool way to get exponential value as the game goes on, especially if you have, you know, mana that you can afford to sink into abilities like this later in the game. It makes something that would normally just be a throwaway 1-drop much more effective when you top deck it a little bit later in the game. And I think it's a really cool mechanic. I'm excited to see what other cards are using this Offspring. But next up, we've got Warren Warleader. Speaking of more cards that use Offspring, this is a 4/4 Rabbit Knight for 2 white and 2, so a 4/4 for 4. Whenever you attack, choose one. You create a 1/1 white rabbit creature token that's tapped and attacking, or attacking creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. And this card also has Offspring 2, so if you pay a total of 6 mana when you cast it, on ETB you'll create a 1/1 version of Warren Warleader alongside the 4/4 version, and both of them will get these triggers. And what's cool about these attack triggers is they don't trigger when the Warren Warleader attacks, they just trigger when you attack, period. So even if you attack with some other crappy creature, and you have the 4/4 and the 1/1 version of the Warleader on the battlefield, you'll get to trigger the ability twice by just attacking with a throwaway token. And you can either create 2 1/1s that are tapped and attacking, or make a 1/1 that's tapped and attacking and give all attackers +1/+1 until end of turn, or just give all of your attackers +2/+2 until end of turn. So there's a lot of value and versatility in this ability, and I think it can get really crazy if we find ways to return the Warren Warleader to our hand and recast it and just keep playing it and paying the Offspring cost and making token copies of it. That seems kind of crazy. Might be a little bit too much of a hoop to jump through for something like that, but I think it's at least worth exploring. And this card is really good no matter what, because at its core it's at least a 4/4 for 4 with this ability, which regardless of whether you use the Offspring ability is going to be pretty decent in the right deck regardless. So next up we've got Parting Gust. 2 white mana for an instant. This is another one that was leaked before spoiler season started. You can gift a tapped fish as you cast it, which means you promise the opponent a gift, in this case a 1/1 blue fish creature token, and then they get that gift before any of the other parts of the card resolve. So if you gift them a tapped fish, they'll get the 1/1 right away, and then the rest of this card is exile target non-token creature. If the gift wasn't promised, you return that creature to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it at the beginning of the next end step. But if the gift was promised, it's just exiled. So basically this is kind of a twofer here. You can either use this as exile removal, instant speed 2-mana exile removal that removes a threat forever. But if you do that, you do give them a 1/1 token, which is probably a good deal, especially considering this is instant speed. But then you can also use this in a completely different way, where you can just use it to flicker something for 2 mana at instant speed if you need to flicker it, either to dodge removal, or to, trigger another ETB trigger, or whatever the case may be. Maybe you chump block with something and you don't want it to die, so you flicker it, and then when it comes back onto the battlefield, it gets a +1/+1 counter. So having a really good instant speed flicker spell that also doubles as a really good instant speed removal spell, I think is really insane. And if you're in the deck that wants either of these, I think it's going to be especially good. Even if you're not really in a flicker deck, being able to have your 2-mana instant speed removal spell also double as a way to protect one of your dudes from your opponent's targeted removal seems like a really good card. So I just think this card is nuts. But it's cool to see this new mechanic here, gift a tapped fish. Next up, we've got Phineas Archer. 2 mana for a 2/2 legendary rabbit archer with vigilance and reach in the colors of Selesnya. That's already pretty decent. And whenever it attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on each other creature you control that's a token or a rabbit. Then if creatures you control have total power 10 or greater, you draw a card. Honestly, this is an insane amount of value off a 2-drop. Granted, it is a rare, so it makes sense, but a 2/2 Vigilance Reach by itself is nothing to scoff at. But being able to just go wide with counters on your board, and sometimes you can even put this on non-rabbits. Like it said, if it's a token, it's going to get the counter regardless of if it's a rabbit. So all of your actual rabbit creature cards, plus all of your rabbit tokens, plus all of your tokens that aren't rabbits. So maybe there's some cool way to, build a deck around having a bunch of tokens that aren't necessarily rabbits, and yet still go deep into rabbit tribal and not really have any opportunity costs, not really lose anything along the way. That seems really cool. And then it also seems really easy to get to total power 10 if you're in a deck like that. So this guy's just drawing you cards all the time, and that's just an insane amount of value on your 2-drop. They're kind of forced to remove this for sure if you're in the right deck where you can get the value off of it. So really, really good for a 2-drop. Next up, we've got Starseer Mentor, a 3/5 bat warlock with flying and vigilance for 5 mana in the colors of Orzhov. At the beginning of your end step, if you gained or lost life this turn, target opponent loses 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card. Very cool. So you can put this in a life gain deck and trigger this ability at the beginning of your end step. But you can also put this in a deck where you're paying life to do things and also trigger this ability. So pretty interesting. It makes me wonder if there are multiple archetypes this guy can slot into. Is there an archetype in this set in Limited where, you can spend life consistently to do things? I'm pretty sure that a gain life deck is going to be viable in Limited for sure. I think we're getting enough support for that archetype. But it'll be really interesting to see if there's multiple decks that this guy can slot into to trigger that ability and actually work out pretty good. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's a decent body that's flying and vigilance, so either way, I think it's pretty decent. And it's Bat Tribal, so what's not to love? Next up, we've got Valley Questcaller. 2 mana, 1 white and 1 for a 2/3 rabbit warrior. Whenever one or more other rabbits, birds, bats, and or mice you control enter the battlefield, you get to scry 1, and other rabbits, bats, birds, and mice you control get +1/+1. This card seems nuts. Not only is it a tribal lord for 2 mana, but it's more than a tribal lord. It's a batching, similar to how Outlaws were batched in Thunder Junction, where it's multiple creature types that all get, the buffs or the synergies. In this case, rabbits, bats, birds, and mice all get buffed by the Questcaller. And it's a 2/3 body for 2 as well. It's not even just a 2/2, and that makes me think that this card's just really pushed, and whatever archetype this is eventually going to slot into in Standard is definitely seeming pushed just by this card's existence. And like the Scry, you don't even need the Scry, it's just perfect gravy. And it's really cool that it triggers just off any time one of these creature types enters the battlefield. So now I'm really interested to see if this is the only batching, how deep this batching goes, and if there's any other batchings of creature types. I have to assume if these 4 creature types are batched together that some of the other creature types get batches as well, and that's just, man, there's going to be so many different possibilities of what direction to go for batching and for deck building with stuff like this, so seems really interesting. Next up, we've got Fireglass Mentor, a 2/1 Lizard Warlock for 2 mana in the colors of Rakdos. At the beginning of your second main phase, if an opponent lost life this turn, you exile the top 2 cards of your library, choose one of them, and until end of turn, you may play that card. Interesting. So it triggers off them losing a life, which, I mean, Rakdos is going to make them do most of the time. You exile the top 2 and only choose one. I guess the one downside to this card is the fact that you have to play it that turn, right? It's not until the end of your next turn. But that being said, you do get the opportunity to know whether you have cards to play before you have to spend any of your mana. You can just go right to combat, swing in, do some damage, hit your second main phase, and get some value. So having a nice little 2-drop that's decently on rate as far as the power, at least, that can get you card advantage when it's just an uncommon, seems really, really good for limited. So I think this guy's going to be an important part of some sort of limited archetype. He seems really, really fun. I kind of wish we had until the end of the next turn, but maybe it would just be too good if that was the case. Next up, we've got Muera TrashTactician. I love the fact that they're going super deep into this whole trash panda idea behind the raccoons flavorfully. This is a 2/4 legendary raccoon warrior for 3 mana in the colors of Gruul. And at the beginning of your first main phase, you get to add either 1 red or 1 green mana for each raccoon you control. Whenever you expend 4, you gain 3 life. Expending 4 means you can expend 4 as you spend your 4th total mana to cast spells during a turn. So whenever you hit your 4th mana spent in any given turn, specifically to cast spells, you're going to expend 4. That's really interesting. We'll get back to that. Whenever you expend 8, you exile the top 2 cards of your library, and until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards. So you just get rewarded for spending mana, which is kind of awesome. Now, expend 8 is kind of crazy because you have to spend a whopping 8 mana to trigger that. And by the time you spend 8 mana, do you have any mana left over to play the top 2 cards that you're exiling? Although in this case, those cards that are exiled do last until the end of your next turn. So I think it does become pretty relevant. It's almost like if you hit the expend 8, you're setting yourself up with cards to use next turn. So you untap, expend 8 to play those cards, which will exile you more for the next turn, and you're constantly getting, you know, a couple cards exiled and ready for the next turn so that you can keep hitting that expend 8. What's worth noting here is you only expend if mana is spent to cast spells. So if you're dumping a bunch of mana into abilities, that mana is not going to count towards reaching expend 4 or expend 8. It's only going to count the mana that you use to cast spells. So you have to be careful of that. This sort of ability is absolutely going to be way, way better in a deck that doesn't have any mana sinks, that isn't spending any mana on abilities, and is spending all of its mana every turn to cast actual spells. And then, of course, this card in particular is going to be that much better if you're in Raccoon Tribal, because if you're going wide with a ton of raccoons, you get to generate a whole bunch of free mana at the beginning of your first main phase every turn, and that mana is going to help you reach those expend 4 and expend 8 thresholds. So really interesting card. Honestly, super good for just 3 mana. Whether you're just in Raccoon Tribal or in a deck that can ramp into a ton of mana and get value off expend 8, or maybe you're in a deck that's trying to do both. Either way, I think this card is worth considering, and it's going to be really interesting to see how good this card is and if it's good enough for standard. Next up, we've got Tidecaller Mentor. This is a 3/3 rat wizard with menace for 3 mana in the colors of Dimir. It has Threshold, so Threshold is coming back, which is interesting. For those of you who don't know, threshold means you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard. That's it. If you do, you turn on threshold. If you drop down to less than 7, threshold gets turned off. So this card has threshold when Tidecaller Mentor enters the battlefield. If 7 or more cards are in your graveyard, you return up to 1 target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So it's just a cool little ETB trigger that if it's a little bit later in the game and your graveyard is big enough, you get to bounce something, any non-land permanent, to its owner's hand for free, while also getting your 3/3 menace for 3, which is already pretty decently on rate. So I think this is a very strong card in Limited, a good way to get some extra value as the game progresses. And it's really cool to note that you can return your own permanents. So if you have ETB triggers and stuff like that, and you want to return one of your own things to get more value, you can do that. So pretty cool card, especially for uncommon. I'm liking the direction they're going for rats here. At least the direction it seems like they're going for rats in their limited archetypes. So really interested to see more of this. But next up we have Camellia the Seed Miser, a 3/3 legendary squirrel warlock with menace for 3 mana in the colors of Golgari. So another 3/3 menace for 3. Seeing a lot of 3/3 menaces for 3. Other squirrels you control have menace, so it's a squirrel lord that gives them all menace, which is nuts. Whenever you sacrifice 1 or more foods, you create a 1/1 green squirrel creature token. So if you're sacrificing your foods one at a time, you're going to get a 1/1 squirrel every single time you sacrifice a food. But if for some reason you're forced to sacrifice all of your food at once, you're only going to get 1/1 squirrel. So keep that in mind. You can also pay 2 and forage to put a +1/+1 counter on each other squirrel you control. Now, forage is another new mechanic in this set, and what it means to forage is you get to choose to either exile 3 cards from your graveyard or sacrifice a food. So I think most of the time you're going to be sacrificing 3 cards, but it's cool that they have this built-in way to forage a lot more efficiently if you're in like a food deck or somehow deep into food tokens. Having those food tokens is a good way to turn on your ability to forage much more efficiently without having to get rid of cards in your graveyard, without having to dig into things that might be turning on threshold for some of your other cards. So really interesting to try to, you know, build around that and brew around that and come up with ideas. The forage ability seems really interesting, and this card in particular seems kind of nuts. Kind of nuts, pun intended. Like, putting counters on all of your squirrels every time you activate that forage ability could result in a really crazy board state if you've already gone wide, and you're probably already going wide if you're in Squirrel Tribal anyway, especially when you can make extra squirrel tokens just by sacking your foods. So big squirrels with menace seems kind of bonkers. Next up we've got Lily Splash Mentor, a 4/4 frog druid with reach for 4 mana in the colors of Simic. So it's already pretty decent, 4/4 reach for 4. You can pay 3 mana in the colors of Simic and exile another target creature you control, and then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it, activate only as a sorcery. So it's got this built-in way of flickering your own things, and you can only activate it as a sorcery, so you can't necessarily flicker in response to removal, save your guy, or anything like that. But if you do need to reset a creature to knock off any detrimental status effects, or, you know, if your opponent casts like some kind of pacifism style aura on your creature and you need to get rid of it, or if you just want to re-trigger some really cool ETB abilities, there's a lot of versatility and an ability like this. And if it was stuck on a creature that wasn't great and you had to kind of play a meh creature in order to get access to an ability like this, it would be kind of a bummer. But the fact that they stuck this on a pretty on-rate decent creature that's already worth playing as a 4/4 reach for 4 anyway, makes this ability way better. It's going to see a lot more play, and I'm really interested to see if this is sort of the Simic archetype, where Simic is trying to flicker things, because normally flickering is much more of a white ability. I don't know, maybe it's a Bant style archetype, we'll have to wait and see, but I'm pretty interested. This card looks pretty cool. Next up we have Alania Divergent Storm, a 3/5 legendary otter wizard for 5 mana in the colors of Izzet. Whenever you cast a spell, if it's the first instant spell, the first sorcery spell, or the first otter spell other than Alania that you've cast this turn, you may have target opponent draw a card. If you do, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. So this is pretty cool. It's sort of a once per turn, but it's not a once per turn period. It's once per turn per instant, per sorcery, and per otter. So you could theoretically, in one turn, play an instant, play a sorcery, play an otter, get a copy of every single one of those things, as long as you let your opponent draw 3 cards. But hey, play it in a deck with Narset so that they can't draw cards, and then you just get insane upside. That seems pretty good. I'm super curious if there might be another way to break this, especially in Standard. So if you have any ideas about what you could do with this kind of chicanery, let me know in the comments. But next up, we've got Pond Prophet. 2 mana for a 1/1 Frog Advisor in the colors of Simic. It's 2 hybrid mana, which is really interesting. So you could play this in mono blue or mono green, or any combination of colors that includes either blue or green. You don't have to be in Simic. And when he enters the battlefield, you get to draw a card. Perfect. Perfect for Simic. We already sort of talked about how Simic looks like it cares about ETBs. So now having a 1/1 that draws you a card for just 2 mana really sets you up with some value. If you can ETB every turn by flickering something like this, draw more cards. That seems really, really good, especially for a common. So a really cool way to support that kind of archetype at the common rarity value. At the common slot, I'm tired. Leave me alone. At the common slot, in limited specifically, I think it's a pretty cool card. Next up, we've got Glarb, Calamity's Augur. This guy is nuts. A 2/4 legendary frog wizard noble with Death Touch for 3 mana in the colors of Sultai. So they might be hinting here that they're going to go deep into 3 color combinations in this set. We'll have to see. But right off the bat, that's the first thing I'm noticing. He also allows you to look at the top card of your library at any time. You don't have to reveal it, which is really cool. You may play lands and cast spells with mana value 4 or greater from the top of your library, which is an insane amount of value, especially in the late game. And you can just tap him to Surveil too, which is kind of nuts because it doesn't cost you any mana. So this guy just seems really, really good. Comes down, can't be cut down, can't be hit with a lightning strike, can't be killed by a lot of that other, a lot of the removal that can hit smaller creatures like that. Is a nice defensive body with Death Touch against aggro decks for just the 3 mana. Gives you a ton of value in the late game. Honestly, even gives you value in the early game because you can play lands, right, from the top of your library. You don't just need to cast spells that cost 4 or more. He also lets you play lands, so even if you can't get value off of playing expensive spells off the top until a little bit later, you can start getting value off of playing lands off the top of your deck immediately. And then, like I said, he's a good 2/4 Death Touch blocker that after blocking, you can just tap him to Surveil to. You don't need any mana. You can tap out every turn to play whatever you want, still have access to that ability. So it kind of just feels like Glarb does everything. That being said, it's going to be really easy to kill Glarb. And yeah, it's probably going to go to the graveyard an awful lot. But I mean, it's just a 3-drop, so I think it's probably still worth playing. Hard to say for sure without testing it out, but card just seems really good. It seems like it does everything you want. Protects you early game with a really good body that can trade for really nasty big threats because of the Death Touch if you need to, and gives you a ton of value late in the game, gives you some silver lining value in the meantime with the free surveilling. Just kind of awesome. I don't know. Let me know where you would play this card in the comments below, because it just seems like it's definitely powerful, and it seems like there's a lot of options as far as where it might be able to be played. Next up, we have Head of the Homestead. Head of the Homestead. A 3/2 rabbit citizen for 5 mana in the colors of Selesnya, and this is another hybrid mana creature, so it can be a mono white or mono green. or, you know, anything containing one of those colors, doesn't have to be both. When it enters, you create 2 1/1 white rabbit creature tokens. Man, we've come a long way since back in the day when commons used to be completely awful. This is not bad. This is playable and limited for sure. Granted, it is slow, it is expensive, but getting 3 bodies for 1 card for a common is actually pretty good. So I don't expect this to be like a first pick or anything like that. It's probably going to be a very, very late pick in draft, but you could do a lot worse for your 22nd, 23rd card to like shore up your curve, have something meaty to, you know, to eventually curve into, especially if you're in token tribal, where you're trying to generate as many tokens as possible to take advantage of certain synergies that going wide with creature tokens is going to let you do. Card like this can really help support that type of strategy in limited. So it's really cool that you have access to something like that at just the common level. That's going to be really easy to pick up just late in a pack. Next up, we've got Thundertrap Trainer. 2 mana for a 1/2 Otter Wizard. It's 1 blue and 1. It has Offspring 4. So this is another Offspring card, except it's much more expensive. You have to pay 4 additional mana to get the token version of this card when you play it, which is a lot. That's 6 total mana. Wow. What does it do? When this creature enters, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So I guess the Offspring 4 here is kind of just a mana sink for the late game, because this is going to be really good on curve for just 2 mana. You get a 1/2 body that replaces itself by looking at the top 4, can grab any non-creature, non-land, put it right into your hand. That's gonna be how you want to play it. Like, you're not getting a lot of value, you're not getting a lot of efficiency, I should say, off of that Offspring 4, right? You're paying 6 mana to get 2 1/2s, and look at the top 4 and grab the best non-creature twice in a row, which is decent card advantage, but very, very expensive card advantage. So what makes this guy so good is the fact that you're just going to play him like normal on curve, on to get some card selection, get the card that you need into your hand, but then he can just be better later in the game. So if you top deck a second copy later on while you're out of gas and you just have the extra mana sitting around and nothing to use it on, you're just able to get that much more value out of a card like this by now making 2 of them, having 2 otters, having 2 wizards for things that care about you having more otters or wizards on the board, of which I think this set is going to care a lot about having more otters on the board, and then just get you 2 of the best of the top 4 cards in a row. So the more I think about this card, the more I like it, but don't be tricked into thinking that first and foremost you want to play it with the Offspring ability. The Offspring ability is very much extra. It's for those moments where you have a bunch of extra mana later in the game and you can just get even more value. So be careful. Don't fall into the trap. You definitely want to play this on curve as soon as possible and not necessarily save it unless you have better things to play. Next up, we've got Strike Force. This is a 1/3 Bird Knight with flying, double strike, and vigilance for 1 white and 2. This card's nuts. It's an uncommon. I mean, granted, it's super small, but you're not going to find many better creatures that are better suited to just boost up with +1/+1 counters or auras or equipment or whatever the case may be. This is just the perfect target for those kinds of cards. Just gives you this like mobile weapons platform that you can just send in for insane damage in the air, double strike damage, while also hanging back as a blocker because of the vigilance. So you definitely want to run this in a deck that has a lot of augmentation, maybe that new Valiant keyword, maybe +1/+1 counter tribal type of stuff, or maybe even an equipment deck. But if you are in that kind of deck, this card could be absolutely insane. If you're not in that kind of a deck, it's just okay, right? It's an okay creature. It's still probably worth using because it is in the air. It blocks decently well, even if it doesn't get buffed. But really, it's those decks where you're buffing this thing to high hell that are going to take the most advantage of a card like this. And it'll be really interesting to see how deep an archetype like that might go in limited in this set. Because this is kind of the perfect card for something like that. But next up we have Maha. It's Feathers Knight. This card is crazy. I'm pretty sure this is one of the Calamity Beasts. Now, this is a 6/5 legendary elemental bird with flying and trample for 2 black and 3, which is already a pretty decent body for mid-range, but it also has ward discard a card, which means if your opponent wants to get rid of it, they're going to have to take on some card disadvantage in the process to do it. And sometimes they can discard a card to try and kill it with their removal spell that they target it with, and then in response, after they pay the ward, you can just use a protection spell on it, and they discarded a card for nothing, and that's pretty awesome. I've done that with cards in the past. But what really makes this creature kinda nutty is that it has this last line of text here. Creatures your opponents control have base... Sorry. It's been a long day, a lot of spoilers. I'm trying to get this out to you guys as quick as possible, so excuse me if I'm tired and I slur my speech a bit. Creatures your opponents control have base toughness 1. Just all of them. For the rest of the game, as long as this guy's still on the battlefield. That is insane. It doesn't touch any of your creatures, so you can use things like... There are a bunch of 1-mana sweepers in Standard right now that just deal 1 damage to every creature. You just use that to wipe your opponent's board. And your guys don't have toughness 1, so you survive. Even better than that, you could just run this in a deck that uses a bunch of first strikers, because I don't care how big your creature's power are, if you're attacking with a bunch of first strikers, like, what is your opponent gonna do? They can't block, they just always die and never trade no matter what if you have a board of first strikers. So this ability is really, really good in something like that. It's also really good with Massacre Girl, so if anybody out there is running Massacre Girl or a Massacre Girl commander deck or anything like that, you should strongly consider putting Maha in the deck. Card just seems nuts. I don't know. I really want to play with it. Maybe it's not as good as I think, but I feel like it's crazy. Let me know in the comments if you agree. But next up we've got Runaway Together. Pretty sure this is a reprint. I think it was in the first Eldraine set, Throne of Eldraine. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. This is 1 blue and 1 for an instant. Choose 2 target creatures controlled by different players. Return those creatures to their owner's hands. Now, a card like this is actually a lot better in this set in particular because of the new Valiant keyword that we already talked about, that new version of Heroic, where when your things become targeted, they can get value sometimes. So, if there are the right creatures with Valiant to pair with a card like this, not only can you bounce their thing to their hand, but you can also get value by targeting your Valiant thing, triggering some kind of, you know, extra value that you can get off of that, while also returning that creature to your hand to maybe replay and get an ETB. So this is definitely going to be best paired with any creature that you have that has an ETB ability, but also has some kind of value off of a Valiant trigger that isn't necessarily like a +1/+1 counter or something like that. So if a card like that exists, this could be really good in conjunction with it. But either way, I think it's still a solid card as instant speed removal. You can protect your creature or remove their threat, so it's got versatility. Really cool that they reprinted this here. Next up we have Artist's Talent. 1 red and 1 for an enchantment class. That's right, enchantment classes return. We have new classes in Standard Magic the Gathering. I didn't think we'd see the day, but it happened. So 1 red and 1, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you may discard a card, and if you do, draw a card. So a little bit of extra rummage value just on all of your non-creatures. But if you level it up to level 2 by paying 1 red and 2, it also makes it so that non-creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And it's important to remember that that first ability is still there as you level up. It gains abilities, it never loses abilities. Level 3, you pay another 1 red and 2, and if a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +2 instead. Is this card meant to be used in a burn deck? It can reduce the cost of all of your burn spells, let you rummage away cards from your hand that are extra lands or whatever as you cast your burn spells, and also just allow all of your burn spells to do an extra 2 damage. I hope that maybe burn is actually going to be viable in standard. Now, I might come to regret saying that if it becomes too prevalent, because that would be obnoxious to constantly face red burn decks. Mono red is obnoxious as it is, we don't need any of that, but it would be cool if burn is viable enough to actually brew a standard deck around finally. So I'll be interested in trying this out, but even in just like an Is It Spellslinger deck, this could be really good, so definitely worth exploring. Just cool in general that they brought classes back. Next up we have Ruthless Negotiation. 1 black for a sorcery. Target opponent exiles a card from their hand, and if this spell was cast from a graveyard, you draw a card, and it has flashback for 1 black and 4. This card seems insane. Now, granted, you don't get to choose what card they discard, but the fact that for just 1 mana, they have to discard a card is kind of okay by itself, and then the fact that you get free card advantage later on in the game by making them discard a card and you draw a card for 5 mana is kind of nuts. Now granted, that is expensive, right? It's not really worth 5 mana to make them discard and you draw. That is super overcosted, but when it's on, you know, the tail end of a card that you already played, that you already got value off of and made them discard a card early in the game, it's actually really good in my opinion. So I think discard tribal could be nuts. We're already pretty close to making something like a discard tribal deck work with Hostile Negotiator and Hopeless Nightmare and things like that. So if we can just double down on that kind of archetype with something like Ruthless Negotiation, just get rid of their entire hand by turn 3 by just slamming 1-drop discard spells, that seems crazy. I'm gonna build that. That seems super fun. Are you excited to see something like that? Let me know in the comments. I'm definitely going to mess around with it. Next up, we have 𝐒𝐏𝐻. 𝐒𝐏𝐻. We're going to call it 𝐒𝐏𝐻. Correct me if I'm wrong. Eater of All. This is a 6/6 legendary elemental cat for 5 mana in the colors of Golgari. Has ward Sacrifice of Food, which seems like it's very difficult to pay, except for when you read the rest of the card. Other creatures are food artifacts in addition to their other types, and have pay 2 mana, tap, sacrifice to gain 3 life. So they literally become foods. They count as artifacts, and they have the ability to sack and gain life just like food tokens. Whenever a food is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on 𝐒𝐏𝐻, Eater of All. So the most important thing to take away from this is this is a 6/6 for 5 that every single time a creature dies, whether it's theirs or yours, it's getting 2 +1/+1 counters. Full stop. Like, that's already kinda nuts. And if they want to target this with removal to get rid of it, they basically have to sacrifice a creature, which is also pretty good because as a 5-drop, if it doesn't get you any value immediately on the turn you play it, sometimes it's difficult to justify that 5 mana cost. So this being able to protect itself so that even if they do get rid of it, they're at card disadvantage. They have to sacrifice a creature and use their removal spell to get rid of your 1 𝐒𝐏𝐻 seems pretty good. And if you force them to sacrifice a food to target it, and then after they sacrifice the food, use a protection spell to protect 𝐒𝐏𝐻 from their targeted removal in response, you still get the 2 +1/+1 counters from them sacking a food, a creature, whatever, and you got to keep your 𝐒𝐏𝐻, which seems like it could be super, super fun. But the other thing worth noting about this card that might go overlooked is the fact that just all other creatures counting as artifacts can be kind of insane. Now you can use artifact removal to just kill their whatever creatures. You can use things that buff up your own artifacts or give you value based off your own artifacts to get you even more value because now all of your creatures are artifacts. So there's a lot of crazy stuff you can do. Is there a card out there that lets you just destroy all artifacts because you could kill every creature on the board that isn't 𝐒𝐏𝐻? So many interesting possibilities. Definitely let me know in the comments if you've thought of a crazy way to use this one, because I truly feel like the potential is kind of endless with this card, and I'm super excited to just experiment with it. Next up, we've got Repel Calamity. 2 mana for an instant, 1 white and 1, and it just destroys target creature with power or toughness 4 or greater. I like this. It's 2 mana, it's instant speed, it doesn't have to target something as it's attacking or blocking, which is a nice breath of fresh air for white. And even though you have to target something with power or toughness 4 or greater, it's power or toughness. A lot of times we've seen toughness 4 or greater, or power 4 or greater, or something like that. But getting to choose either power or toughness 4 or greater makes it a lot more versatile. There's a lot more targets it can hit, and I think it's actually pretty decent removal for limited. Is it good enough for constructed? Probably not. But in limited, I think this is going to be a little bit better than it looks on the surface. I think it's going to be slightly slept on at first, before people start to realize just how versatile getting to choose toughness or power is for a piece of removal like this. I think it can hit a lot more targets than it might otherwise seem like it can hit, which is really, really nice. Next up, we've got Tempest Angler. This is 3 mana in the colors of Izzet for a 2/2 otter wizard. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on Tempest Angler. So this is just a really good common way to get some value in the deck that's trying to play a lot of non-creature spells, specifically in limited. It's also nice that it uses hybrid mana, right? So again, this doesn't have to be an Izzet. It can be in mono red, mono blue, or any color combinations that uses either red or blue. It doesn't have to use both, which is nice. This is another perfect example of the kinds of commons they're starting to put in these sets to make limited more approachable. They're all kind of playable, a little bit underwhelming, but never unplayable. It's going to slot into the kind of deck that wants it pretty easily, and honestly, it can grow pretty quick into a relevant threat if you don't be careful. So honestly, pretty interesting common here to support that kind of archetype. Next up, we've got Valley Rotcaller. This is 1 black and 1 for a creature squirrel warlock. It is a 1/3 with menace for just 2 mana. And whenever it attacks, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of other squirrels, bats, lizards, and rats you control. So this answers our question from earlier. Are there other batchings? Yes. It looks like every 2-color combinations of creatures for a specific monocolor has a batching. That is my assumption here. So for example, squirrels are in black and green. Bats are in black and white, lizards are in black and red, and rats are in black and blue. So each of those 2 color combinations has one of those creature types associated with it, and all 4 of those creature types that are associated with one of black's 2 color pairings is batched into a bigger batch of creature types that black things will care about. So I'm pretty sure all 5 colors are going to get these types of batchings. And that's really interesting because we saw what batching Outlaws did in Thunder Junction, and taking that to the next level and having more versatility in the types of batches available to you, having potentially 5 different batchings that you can build into, seems like there's a lot of options and a lot of potential with where you can go. But this card in particular is just really good. Every time it swings, you drain for a whole bunch of life, as long as you're sticking to the creatures in your batch. And the wider you go with these 4 creature types, the more you drain for when you swing. And because of the menace, they can't just chump block it, right? They have to block with at least 2 creatures. So if you do have a go wide field of attacking creatures, it's really hard to block this to get rid of it, to get it off the field, without allowing even more other creatures to get through and get you so low on life that it's going to be easy for your opponent to just take you out of the game. So some really interesting mechanics at work here. Honestly think this card is really good. It triggers on attack. It doesn't have to deal combat damage, similar to the Bronco that we got in the last set. So I don't know, I kind of love this. I'm excited to brew with it for sure. But before we get to that, I really need some coffee, so coffee break. So really quick while I'm grabbing some much needed coffee, I just wanted to show you guys this Sword of Fire and Ice. Now, it's a special guest card, it is not a part of the standard legal set, but I still wanted to show you. I think it looks adorable, and you otters see it. Also, really quickly just want to apologize for my stuttering and obvious exhaustion. I've been grinding videos all day, and it was really important to me to get these spoilers out to you as soon as possible, so I pushed myself to get them all done in one video. No rest for the wicked. Glorious nectar of the gods. Where were we? Junkblade Bruiser. 5 mana for a 4/5 Raccoon Berserker with Trample in the colors of Gruul. It is hybrid mana, so you can run it mono green or mono red or any combination of those colors. And whenever you expend 4, Junkblade Bruiser gets +2/+1 until end of turn. So it's not going to trigger off every 4, right? It's not going to be like 4, 8, 12. It's specifically on 4, your 4th total mana cost. So it can only trigger once. It's really important to not lose sight of that. You're not going to get multiple triggers off of expend 4. Just the first time you spend 4 mana, which honestly on a common is actually pretty decent. This counts as a raccoon. You're going to be able to get all of those synergies. Having a 4/5 trample body that's just gonna basically always be a 6/6 trample body as long as you're actually playing 4 mana worth of stuff every turn, which if you're in Gruul, you should be doing, seems pretty good. A nice little 22nd, 23rd card to add to your limited archetype for sure. Next up, we've got Wandertail Mentor. Speaking of raccoons, 2 mana in the colors of Gruul for a 2/2 Raccoon Bard. This time it is not hybrid mana. Whenever you expend 4, you put a +1/+1 counter on Wandertail Mentor, and you can tap it to add either green or red mana to your mana pool. So it's a 2 mana 2/2 mana dork, except it just automatically gets bigger as you start spending mana. So as soon as you hit like turn 3 with this, you use it to make a 4th mana in addition to your 3 land drops. You play any combination of spells, really. You don't have to play a 4-drop, right? Any combination of spells that use all 4 of your available mana, and this becomes a 4/4. And then on turn 4, you spend 4 or more mana worth of stuff. Use this for mana if you want. It becomes a 4/4. It's going to be 3/3, and then a 4/4, and then a 5/5, and then a 6/6. So it just keeps getting bigger as you spend at least 4 mana every turn, which you should be doing with a mana dork like this. So I don't know, I feel like this guy's actually a little bit better than he looks. He's gonna get really big really quick just without you even realizing it, with a focus on him just being a mana dork to help you get there. I don't know, it seems really cool, especially in Raccoon Tribal. I'm excited to see if it's definitely going to be a really fun archetype in Limited. I'm wondering if Raccoon Tribal could be a thing in Constructed. Can we do it? Can we make it work in Standard? We're going to find out. Next up, we've got Ral Crackling Wit. This is another one that was leaked before spoiler season ever started, but we're going to go over it again here. This is 4 mana in the colors of Izzet for a 4 loyalty Planeswalker. It has a static ability. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a loyalty counter on Ral Crackling Wit. You can add +1 loyalty to create a 1/1 blue and red otter creature token with prowess, -3 loyalty to draw 3 cards and then discard 2 cards, or -10 loyalty to draw 3 cards and get an emblem with instant and sorcery spells you cast have Storm. This card is insane. We've already gone over this back when it leaked, but just to summarize the craziness with this card, because non-creature spells are putting additional loyalty on Ral, you can do things like play non-creature spells that have Proliferate, and that adds 2 loyalty counters onto Ral. All you really need to do is play 3 non-creature spells that Proliferate after Ral hits the board, and he has enough to ultimate. And if he ultimates, all of your instant and sorcery spells have Storm. And it's really easy to overlook how crazy that is, because giving just one of your instant or sorcery Storm would be pretty nuts if you play a whole bunch of like Opt or shock, whole bunch of 1 mana spells into some kind of crazy spell that now has storm, that would be nuts. But all of your spells are going to have storm. So when you cast that opt, that's going to have storm. And then when you cast that shock, that's going to have storm. All of the spells that you're building up to your big spell with are all going to have storm, all go off exponentially. It's almost impossible to not just win on the spot if you can get to a point where you can use that ultimate, because the sheer insanity of every spell storming is just going to be bananas. And since you can get there pretty easily with proliferate spells, I'm really worried that this could be insane in standard, but I don't know. Let me know if you think I'm out of my mind. Let me know in the comments. I just think the card is awesome. Next up, we've got Bravekin Duo. 1 white mana for a 1/1 rabbit mouse. Pretty cool that it has both creature types. You can pay 1 and tap it, and target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn, but activate only as a sorcery. Nice little bit of value here at the common slot. I think what makes this a little bit better than it might otherwise look like is just the fact that it's both creature types, right? There's ways to synergize tribal payoffs where this is getting a ton of value off multiple tribal type payoffs instead of just rabbit or just mouse. So in that way, it coming down as your 1-drop can actually be pretty effective once you start to get your synergies going. And even if you don't start to get your synergies going, in the meantime, it can be a nice little mana sink if you have an extra mana lying around to just make one of your guys that's gonna swing in a little bit stronger, get through for a little bit more damage, or maybe make the difference between them actually being able to swing in or whatever and not die in combat. So nice little bit of value here, but definitely the best part about the card is the fact that it's a 1-drop that's both a rabbit and a mouse, so do not lose sight of that. Next up, we've got Stormcatch Mentor. This is a 2 mana 1/1 otter wizard with haste and prowess in the colors of Izzet. This is not hybrid mana, so you do have to actually be an Izzet for this. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Man, power creep is a hell of a thing. So you're slamming this on 2, it's swinging in with haste, it has prowess, and it's making all of your instants and sorceries cost 1 less. I feel like it wasn't too long ago where a card like this would just make your instant and sorceries cost 1 less and still be pretty okay. The fact that this also has haste and prowess on top of that is like pushed through the roof. Otter Tribal is going to be nuts. We ought to play it. Next up, we've got Clement the Wart. I love that name. 3/3 legendary frog druid with vigilance for 3 mana in the colors of Simic. A lot of 3/3 with a keyword for 3 in a 2-color pair. I'm noticing a trend. Whenever Clement the Wart or another creature you control enters, return up to 1 target creature you control with lesser mana value to its owner's hand. So it definitely reinforces that idea that Simic wants to flicker things. Frogs you control have the ability to tap, add green or blue, spend this mana only to cast a creature's spell. So go wide with frogs, use your frogs to ramp out ridiculous spells with extra mana, but every time you are playing a creature, you have to return, well, you don't have to, it's up to 1, right? You get to return a creature with lesser mana value to its owner's hand. So you could set up these really interesting loops where, like, every time you play a creature, you return the one that's 1 mana less to your hand, replay it, return the one that's 1 mana less than that to your hand, replay it, and then you can just keep going down the chain. Every time you cast a creature that's 1 mana more, you just reset the chain all over again and keep returning things to your hand, keep recasting them, and because all of your frogs get the ability to generate mana, it should be really easy to recast a bunch of things every turn. There could be some really, really interesting decks built around this. Now I'm super interested. Plus the fact that it has vigilance means it can swing in and then tap for mana afterwards, because it doesn't say other frogs have that ability, it's all frogs, including itself. I'm really thinking there's going to be some interesting things you can do with returning stuff to your hand, though. We already know there's a lot of support in Simic for the idea of flickering things or, you know, being able to replay your creatures. So having even more value in that direction here with this card seems like there's just A deck that's dying to exist. Will it be something that makes an impact in Standard? Will it be usable in Standard? I hope so. Because some kind of a cool flickering, you know, blinking deck seems like it could be super interesting if it's good enough. So, be really interesting to see what kind of payoffs we can get for all of this enabling that we've seen. But the potential is there, and this card seems super cool. Next up, we have Veteran Guard Mouse. This is a 3/4 Mouse Soldier for 4 mana in the colors of Boros, but it is a hybrid mana, so mono white, mono red, any combination of those colors. It has Valiant. Whenever Veteran Guard Mouse becomes the target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, it gets +1/+0 and first strike until end of turn, and you scry 1. That seems pretty decent for a common. A 3/4 for 4, and every time you target it for the first time in a turn, not only do you get whatever the spell's doing anyway, which is probably going to be worth the spell to begin with, but you're also getting to turn this into a 4/4 first striker and scry 1. Again, this is another example of a decent common where it's none of the commons are unplayable, right? It's not something you're going to pick very high, but when you get down to the bottom of your pack, you don't mind taking something like this and using it to, you know, finish off your deck, that 22nd, 23rd card if you're coming up short. It's a perfectly fine and playable card that's going to give you a lot of extra value if you're in a deck that can focus on the Valiant side of things. Next up, we have Hop to It. 1 white and 2 for a sorcery. Create 3 1/1 white rabbit creature tokens. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think this might be the first time we've ever got a spell that costs 3 or less that gives you 3 creatures for just the 1 spell. 3 1/1 white rabbit creature tokens is a lot if there are archetypes that really care about going wide with tokens and are able to buff up those tokens or get sacrifice value off having all those tokens. Kind of the sky's the limit here on this. So I just love that a card like this exists. Normally, we would get like a 3-drop that gives us 2 tokens or something like that, but getting 3 tokens just straight up, granted we don't have any extra value in addition to the tokens, but when you're getting 3 instead of 2, doesn't really matter. So yes, there is going to absolutely be a token deck in Constructed. Will this be a part of it? We'll have to wait and see. Next up, we've got Dreamdew Entrancer. This is a 3/4 frog wizard with reach for 4 mana in the colors of Simic. And when it enters, you tap up to 1 target creature and put 3 stun counters on it. If you control that creature, you draw 2 cards. This is super interesting. So you can use it to lock down their creature for 3 turns if you want. Or if you don't mind locking down one of your crappier creatures with 3 stun counters, you can just use this to draw cards. Honestly, a 4 mana 3/4 reach that draws you 2 cards when it ETBs is really good in and of itself. Now granted, you have to be in a very specific deck where you can use it that way and build around it in order to be able to use it that way. But still, the fact that that is a potential possibility makes this card really good. And the fact that if you're not in a scenario where you can do that, you can just use this to lock down their best creature for 3 turns with 3 stun counters. I mean, I'm just seeing all upside here. This card seems super cool. I'm excited to see what we can build with it. Next up, we've got Shoreline Looter, a 1/1 rat rogue for 1 blue and 1. It can't be blocked, period, and it has threshold, so whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card, and then you discard a card unless 7 or more cards are in your graveyard. So this is actually a really interesting graveyard enabler, or like self-mill enabler, where you're swinging every turn, it can't be blocked, every turn you're pitching stuff to the graveyard until you get threshold turned on. And at that point, you have a big enough graveyard to probably make all of your graveyard synergies that are in your deck work with that graveyard that you have. And instead of having to pitch cards now and having to loot cards away, it's just every time it hits, it's just drawing you a card. Just straight up drawing you a card. Like, both sides of this are good if you're in the right deck. I kind of love it. The fact that it can just turn into an unblockable card drawing machine seems really good to me, on top of the fact that it can enable self-mill strategies along the way. So really interesting uncommon. I'm kind of loving what they're doing with rats here. And it's also worth noting that we finally have a mono blue rat. I don't know if this is the first one we've ever gotten, but it makes sense as rats are the Dimir color. combination, the tribe that's in that color combination. So glad to finally see a blue rat. Next up, we've got 𝐒𝐏𝐻𝐈𝐋𝐄𝐑 Cultivator, a 2/3 squirrel warlock for 3 mana in the colors of Golgari. It is hybrid mana, so again, green or black or any combination. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may forage, which means you may exile 3 cards from your graveyard or sacrifice a food if you'd like. And whenever you forage, put a +1/+1 counter on 𝐒𝐏𝐻𝐈𝐋 Cultivator. So the fact that it can just forage without really giving you any value for the forage is just an extra little way to turn on the ability to put counters on this. But really what you want to be doing with this card is putting it in a deck where you have other ways to forage to get value off of your foraging, and then the counters that you're getting on the cultivator are just extra. They're gravy, so that you're getting the absolute most efficiency out of all of your cards. So in that archetype, especially in limited, I think this card is going to be great. It's going to be a high pick common. It's not necessarily going to be an early pick in general, but as far as the commons go, I think this is going to be pretty high, and I think it's going to see a decent amount of play. Next up, we've got Beza, the Bounding Spring. This is a 4/4 legendary elemental elk for 2 white and 2. And when it enters, it just evens pretty much everything up. You create a treasure token if an opponent controls more lands than you. You get 4 life if they have more life than you. You get 2 1/1 blue fish creature tokens if they have more creatures than you. And you draw a card if they have more cards in hand than you. I don't know exactly what deck's going to play this or where this fits best. Maybe this goes in a very creature-light control deck where you're just able to use this to stall out your opponent and get a whole bunch of value along the way in any of the ways that you happen to be not keeping pace with your opponent. It catches you up and allows you to stall out the game until you can get to where you need to get to with your deck. So that's kind of my first thought, is that it might go in some kind of a control shell. But really, I feel like there's so many different ways you could use a card with this. So I'm excited to see what kind of decks pop up with this in the list. If you have any ideas of how to use this card, definitely let me know in the comments. Next up, we've got Fell. This is the new Murder. 1 black and 1 for a sorcery, destroy target creature. Power creep's a hell of a thing. We knew this was coming. I had a feeling when we were looking over Maro's teasers that the new casting cost for destroying a creature was going to be 2 mana and it was going to be sorcery speed. But my guess was it was going to be double black. And it's actually a little bit better than that. It's 1 black and 1. It's more splashable. It is sorcery speed. It's not instant like Murder. But the fact that it's just 2 mana, destroy a creature, shows you how far power creep has come and where we're at. Like, the just baseline cost for destroying creatures at this point is 2 mana. That's just where we're at, and that's kind of crazy if you think about it. So Murder, so long, farewell, hardly knew ya, see you never. Next up, we've got Seedpod Squire. This is 4 mana for a 3/3 flying bird scout in the colors of Azorius. It is hybrid mana, so mono blue, mono white, any combination. Whenever Seedpod Squire attacks, target creature you control without flying gets +1/+1 until end of turn. I kind of like it. Honestly, as a common, you could do a lot worse. Getting a decently relevant threat that's in the air, that's evasive, that's not super overcosted. It's not necessarily on rate, but it's not so expensive that you're going to not want to put it in your deck, right? 3/3 flyer for 4 is fine. And it's easily splashable because of the hybrid mana. That's also a very important thing to note. And then it just like makes one of your ground dudes bigger when it swings, and usually has no reason to not swing because it has evasion. So it's just that little bit of extra spice that's going to make, if there's a deck that cares about balancing flyers with non-flyers, this is going to be a decent add to that. And again, another really good common for that 22nd, 23rd card to just flesh out your deck. Next up, we've got Tender Wild Guide. 1 green and 1 for a 2/2 Possum Druid. It has Offspring 2, so you can pay a total of 4 mana when you play it if you want, and you get a second copy of this as a token. It can tap to add a mana of any color. It can also tap to put a +1/+1 counter on itself. Actually seems really good. Getting a 2 mana 2/2 mana dork that mana fixes you and if you don't need the mana, can just start putting counters on itself every turn, is pretty decent already. But then if you like top deck another copy later in the game and have the extra mana, you can just make 2 for just 1 card, and that seems really good to me. I don't know, we're seeing a lot of really good 2-mana mana dorks come out of this set, and also out of Duskmourn. We saw one in the initial Duskmourn spoilers, and if you haven't seen that yet, it is available on the channel, so definitely check that out. But this card just is good. All of these 2-mana mana dorks that are just getting pushed with all of this really good extra value. What a time to be alive, man. Possum. Can we do Possum Tribal? Can that be a thing? Next up, we have Cindering Cutthroat, a 3/2 Lizard Assassin for 3 mana in the colors of Rakdos, and again, it's hybrid mana, so mono red, mono black, or any combination. It enters with a +1/+1 counter on it if an opponent lost life this turn. So if you swing in and hit, it's a 4/3 for 3 that's very easily splashable, which is super nice. But it doesn't stop there. For 1 Rakdos hybrid mana and 1 colorless, it gains menace until end of turn. So, I don't know, this seems really good as a common. Again, I know I sound like a broken record repeating myself constantly, but the commons in this set, I definitely see a trend of like nothing is unplayable. Like you're never gonna pick this up super early, but you're never gonna be, you know, ashamed to put it in your deck. This is a fine 22nd, 23rd card. It's gonna get some decent value. Sometimes it's actually gonna be really good. Come down on 3 as a 4/3 that can sometimes get menace for 3 mana. That could be really good. It could also potentially utilize, you know, lizard tribal shenanigans. So, what a fun card. What a cool common. Next up we have Cash Grab. That's funny. I see what you did there. 1 green and 1 for an instant. Mill 4 cards. You may put a permanent card from among the cards milled this way into your hand. If you control a squirrel or return a squirrel card to your hand this way, you also make a food token, which on first glance seems not good enough to be the extra juice on this card, but then when you start to think about, we've already seen some cards that really care about foods, that let you forage and sacrifice food to get value, and you start to realize how much those food tokens matter way more than traditionally food tokens have mattered. So getting that food token could be a really big deal, especially in the right limited deck if you're in that archetype. So pretty cool card here. Also, it's play off words, so play on words, play Magic the Gathering. Next up we have Kidnap. 2 blue and 2 for an enchantment aura. You may gift a card as you play it, which means promise an opponent a gift as you cast the spell. If you do, when it enters, they draw a card. You enchant a creature, and when Kidnap enters, you tap enchanted creatures. If the gift wasn't promised, you put 3 stun counters on it, and either way, you control enchanted creature. So, let me break this down for you. This is basically control magic that taps the creature. 4 mana, you play this on whatever creature you want, you steal it, it becomes tapped. Now, it also gets 3 stun counters unless you let them draw a card. So, it can either just be tapped with no stun counters, and they draw a card, or it can be tapped, not untapped, for 3 turns, but you don't let them draw a card. And this is a little bit better than it looks on the surface, because if you just absolutely need to remove a thing because it's going to kill you, or because it's a bomb and it's game breaking, you don't have to let them draw a card, right? It's just strictly better removal in a way. Granted, it's 4 mana, but you remove the big threat with 3 stun counters on it, and it doesn't really matter that you don't get to use it right away because it's off of your opponent's field, right? But then on top of that, if you do the small price, pay the small price of letting them draw a card, they don't get this. You don't get the stun counters. You can just use it on your next turn. Everything is fine. Another thing to take note with a card like this is sometimes you don't care if the thing is tapped or not. Sometimes you're getting value off an ability on whatever you're stealing, regardless of whether it's tapped or untapped, and that might even be the reason that you want it. So there are upside silver lining values to this card, regardless of whether you put the stun counters on or not. But I like the versatility. It's got that kind of charm feel where you get options, and you're always going to choose the best option for you, the worst option for your opponent. So you don't have to let them draw a card. You also don't have to wait 3 turns to use the creature that you steal. You get the option of either or, which is really nice. So I think this is a pretty cool card, and I like the name. Next up, we have Hunter's Talent. This is another enchantment class. 1 green and 1. When it enters the battlefield, target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. You can level it up for 1 green and 1 to level 2, and at that point, whenever you attack, target attacking creature gets +1/+0 and trample until end of turn. And then if you want, you can level it up to level 3 for 1 green and 3. And at the beginning of your end step, this is every end step, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. I think this card is amazing. First of all, the fact that there's this much value on an uncommon is nuts. But you're using it as removal the turn it enters, so everything else is gravy, right? You're using it as removal, you're killing the thing you need to for 2 mana. It's a bite spell, it's not even a fight spell, right? It's better, it's a bite spell, so you've already gotten your value. So at that point, it's just gravy. If you have extra mana one turn, sure, level it up. And when you attack, one of your attackers is going to be strictly better. And if you have extra mana another turn, sure, put it at level 3. And then for the rest of the game, anytime you have a power 4 or greater creature at the end of turn, you just get to draw an extra card. So if you're running out of gas later in the game, you're not going to have things to spend your mana on anyway. You use your mana to level up to level 3, and now you're not running out of gas. You're drawing extra cards every turn. Seems awesome. Am I crazy for thinking this is as good as it is? Let me know in the comments. I think it's awesome. Next up, we have Mind Drill Assailant, a 2/5 rat warlock for 4 in the colors of Dimir. It is hybrid mana, so black, blue, or any combination. It has Threshold. As long as 7 or more cards are in your graveyard, it gets +3/+0, becomes a 5/5 for 4, which is pretty decent. You can also pay 3 mana, one of which is a Dimir hybrid, to surveil 1. So this is already pretty decent as a 4 mana 5/5 in the right deck that's able to turn on Threshold easily. It's also going to get all of your rat synergy payoffs, which will be really nice. But having this little mana sink built in that for 3 mana you can just surveil 1, not only scry into the cards that you need to, but also fill up your graveyard to turn on the Threshold or turn on any other graveyard synergies that you might have, like Forage and stuff like that. There's just a lot of silver lining value that's easy to overlook in a card like this, and it just goes to show you that they were really clever with the way they made commons, where none of them are so good you're going to want to pick them early, but all of them are super useful. So, really cool card. Next up, we've got Thorn Vault Forager. Talk about your 2 mana dorks. 1 green and 1 for a 2/2 Squirrel Ranger. It can tap for a green mana regardless. It can also tap and forage to add 2 mana in any combination of colors. So not only can you get mana of any color, it can be 2 mana of different colors. You could tap this and make a red and a black if you want, which is nuts. And the fact that you can forage in a versatile way by either exiling 3 cards from your graveyard or sacrificing a food, whichever's best for you in the moment, is really nice. But it doesn't stop there. You can also pay 1 green and 3, tap it, search your library for a squirrel card, reveal it, and then put it into your hand and shuffle. This card just does everything. Not only does it ramp you regardless of whether you can forage or not, it ramps you even more and color fixes you if you can forage, and it just can tutor up your best squirrels, put them in your hand so that you never run out of gas and always have things to play, always can find your best squirrel payoff cards. Just seems bananas. If that last ability was the only reason to run something like this, and you know the card wasn't super on rate outside of that, I would be very skeptical of the card. But the fact that the card is good enough to run even without that ability, and that ability is just extra, makes this card really good. I think it's going to be good early curving, it's going to be good late giving you value. It's just good all around. Squirrels are coming, and you better be ready. I need more coffee. You better be ready for the squirrels. Next up, we have Moonrise Cleric. This is a 2/3 Bat Cleric with flying for 3 mana in the colors of Orzhov. Once again, hybrid mana. and whenever it attacks, you gain a life. Very simple, evasive flyer that's going to be able to trigger life gain synergies. So I'm hoping there are a lot of decent, lower rarity life gain payoffs in this set for limited, because this card would be a really good enabler as long as that's the case. Being able to just gain 1 life every turn when swinging on an evasive creature that most of the time is going to be able to swing without worrying about, you know, getting blocked and eaten, could be really good if you have plenty of ways to get payoff off gaining a life for the turn. That being said, definitely not good enough for a constructed life gain deck, but the fact that life gain seems like it's going to be prevalent in this set does give me hope that there will be cards that will be really good for a standard life gain constructed deck, and I'm excited to try and build something like that, so we'll see what happens. Next up, we've got Wear Down. 1 green and 1 for a sorcery. Destroy target artifact or enchantment, and you can gift a card as you play this, which again means that you're going to allow them to draw a card before all of the other effects of the card resolve. And if the gift was promised, you instead destroy 2 target artifacts or enchantments. So pretty cool here because you don't have to, right? You can just destroy the worst artifact or enchantment and then that's it for 2 mana. But if you really need to get rid of 2, if they have just insane bomby things that absolutely need to go away, you just let them draw a card and you get rid of both of them. You don't have to worry about which one to get rid of, right? So I like the versatility here. I like that no matter what, you can destroy something without them drawing a card. So it's just upside after that at that point. So I really like this card. Next up, Season of Weaving. We're getting towards the tail end of our spoilers here. We've got a cycle of seasons, and we've seen 3 of them, so we're going to go over all 3 of those in a row. This is Season of Weaving, 2 blue and 4 for a sorcery, and when you play it, you get to choose up to 5 paws worth of modes. You may choose the same mode more than once. So you basically get to mix and match. It's a lot like spree cards from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, with the main difference being that you don't actually have to pay any extra mana. You just are limited by how many times you can choose certain options by how many paws they cost. So for 1 paw, you get to draw a card. For 2 paws, you get to choose an artifact or a creature you control and make a token that's a copy of it. And then for 3 paws, you return each non-land, non-token permanent to its owner's hand. So this has, again, the versatility of something like a charm, but it goes one step further because you can choose modes multiple times and choose multiple modes and choose different combinations depending on what's best for your current game state. So you could just play this and draw 5 cards if you wanted. You could just do that. That's a thing. If that was all it did, it wouldn't be good. It would be a little too expensive. But the fact that that's an option in the right scenarios, that could be right. You know, if you just win by having a full hand again, just draw 5 cards and take over the game. But you can also do something like choose 2 artifacts or creatures to make token copies of and draw a card, which is a lot of value for 6 mana, especially if the things that you're copying are very valuable things that are going to get you crazy ETB triggers or, you know, just be insanely good permanents on the battlefield. You could also, for 3 paws, return each non-land, non-token permanent to its owner's hand, so you could do things like return everything, but also make a token copy of something. And since it returns non-tokens, you get to keep that. So for 6 mana, you make a token copy of your best thing, and then bounce that thing and all other non-land, non-tokens, so that that's the only thing on the battlefield. Your opponent's board is back in their hand, and now you can just get value with whatever that thing was that you made a token of. So a lot of different ways to combine things here. You could just return all non-land, non-token permanents and draw 2 cards if you wanted. Super versatile, and I kind of love it. It's also worth noting that there was a card in Outlaws of Thunder Junction which would get you interesting triggered abilities based on how many modes that you chose on a modal card. So with these new season cards, I think that card might become a little bit more playable and a little bit more interesting. So that might be worth exploring in a brew when this set launches. But we're gonna move on. The next season is Season of Loss. 2 black and 3 for a sorcery. Again, choose up to 5 paws worth of modes, and you may choose the same mode more than once. For 1 paw, each player sacrifices a creature. For 2 paws, draw a card for each creature you control that died this turn. And for 3 paws, each opponent loses X life, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. So, you can make them sack 5 creatures. Or, you could draw 2 cards for each creature you controlled that died this turn, and sacrifice a creature. Make every player sacrifice a creature. Or, you could make them lose a bunch of life, and draw a card for each creature you control that died this turn. Or make them lose a bunch of life, and each player sacrifices 2 creatures. And, you know, all of the modes kind of synergize with each other in different ways. So depending on how you're able to set up the game state before you cast this, you can get different amounts of value off combining different, you know, different modes. So, again, I'm really liking this design space. I'm thinking this card is really interesting. The fact that you can draw 2 cards for every creature that died is a little scary, and I'm worried that in the right deck, this could just be utterly absurd. And once again, it gets that versatility that charms tend to get, and that's going to make this a little bit better than it looks. You need to be careful when you're gauging cards that have multiple options, that have that versatility of choosing which way they can be played, because even if each of the modes isn't quite worth the mana that you're investing in, the versatility makes up for it. So cards that do that are way better than they first appear on the surface. So a card like this, I think is going to end up being pretty good. But let me know in the comments if you agree. And the last season that we saw today was Season of the Bold. 2 red and 3 for a sorcery. Again, choose up to 5 paws worth of modes. You may choose the same mode more than once. For 1 paw, you create a tapped treasure token. For 2 paws, you exile the top 2 cards of your library, and until the end of your next turn, you may play them. And for 3 paws, until the end of your next turn, whenever you cast a spell, Season of the Bold deals 2 damage to up to 1 target creature. Seems kind of crazy. So you can set up a scenario where you exile the top 2 cards of your library and buff all of... Wait, it's not even just buffing damage, right? It's dealing 2 damage to a creature every time you cast a spell. So exile two cards to play next turn, and then also deal 2 damage to a creature every time you play a card next turn. Seems nutty. If you have extra mana where you can play more spells the turn that you cast Season of the Bold, it gets even crazier. And the fact that you can just make tapped treasure tokens to use on the next turn if you need to is also pretty crazy. So I wonder if there's some kind of a combo deck we could make that's sort of built around the 3rd mode there, the 3 paws, and making all of your spells just shock a creature. There's just a lot of interesting versatility, just like all of the seasons that we've seen. There's a lot of interesting ways to use this, and again, because it's modal, because you get to choose just like a charm, all of these ways of playing this spell are gonna be a little bit better than they look on the surface. But that brings us to our last card of today, Osteomancer Adept, a 2/2 Squirrel Warlock with Death Touch for 1 black and 1. Honestly, already pretty good. But you can also tap it, and until end of turn, you may cast creature spells from your graveyard by foraging in addition to paying their other costs. If you cast a spell this way, that creature enters with a finality counter on it. So what you're telling me is, it's a 2/2 Death Toucher for 2, that for no mana can tap each turn and basically be a Yawgmoth's Will. Is it just me, or is this bananas? You just, every single turn, you can just replay whatever creatures are in your graveyard. All you have to do is exile some more stuff from your graveyard or sacrifice a food in order to do it. Granted, whatever you're bringing back has a finality counter on it, but if you're filling up your graveyard in order to be able to have things to exile, to forage, to play things from the graveyard, you're always going to have a really full graveyard. So it doesn't really matter if the stuff you're bringing back dies and gets exiled, because you constantly have more stuff in the graveyard to grab. So this is just constantly playing more creatures from the graveyard every turn. This is insane. This guy is just crazy, crazy value in the late game. If your opponent plays this, you either need to kill it right away, or you need to kill them before they can start getting the value off of this card. Either way, it has an automatic target on its back, and it's just insane. And I'm going to say again, it's basically, granted it is only creatures, but it's basically Yawgmoth's Will every turn, for free, for no mana, right? Like, is it just me, or is that insane? I have to know, am I losing my mind? I might be losing my mind. I am exhausted. I need more coffee. That's for sure. So let me know in the comments, am I losing my mind, or is this card as insane as it seems? Because I think it's insane, and the fact that it's a squirrel has me really excited, because Squirrel Tribal is gonna be fun. But that's it for today. Ton more spoilers will be on the way tomorrow. I'm gonna try and keep up with everything every day, so expect that video when all of those spoilers drop. But in the meantime, I will be putting spoiler shorts up on the channel to talk about, you know, cards here and there that slip out, that come out before I can, you know, get up a full video to go over them. So definitely check out the spoiler shorts playlist that I have that I'm going to link in the comments and in the description. Check that out to stay up to date on all the spoilers that, you know, might come out at the last minute tonight or super early tomorrow. So anyway, with all of that out of the way, make sure you like the video if you haven't already, because it helps my channel so much. It helps this video get out to so many more people, and I really need the help. And you guys that have been helping me all along, thank you so much. It honestly means the world to me. Honestly, sincerely, I'm exhausted. I need coffee, but I am so appreciative. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe. Tons of crazy content on the way. Lots more spoilers and some crazy deck ideas already. So as soon as early access comes around for this set, you better believe we're going to have some crazy stuff going on and some crazy deck text popping up. So like, subscribe, do the things, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.